In this video, just as an introduction to innate immunity, we see animals on the right. So animals, they need to eat stuff to get through their day. Animals, they don't perform photosynthesis. They're not decomposing dead stuff like this fungus. So the only way that they get their energy, their organic carbon, is to eat stuff. So the deer is eating plants. This spider is eating an insect. And we humans, we eat stuff. When we look at what's on our dinner plate, our lunch plate, our breakfast plate, etc., there are plants, there are animals. We get our stuff from others. So we need stuff to get through the day. We need energy, we need carbon, so we take from others. There are bananas, there are chickens, there is lettuce, there are olives, there are peanuts, there are, pigs, etc., which will not make it through the day because we eat them. We say we need stuff to get through our day. You have stuff we need, we're going to take from you. Actually, that's part of the definition of being an animal, all right? So that's what animals do. There's a problem, however, because then we ourselves, we then are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We have this organic stuff. And now when we go to this fungus, just as an example, they want it. So other organisms in this world look at us as meat, the same way that we look at what's on our lunch plate and say, you have stuff that we need. Then this fungus, just as an example, can then secrete enzymes into the environment, which could be this rotting wood, or it could be our skin, and then digest this material and liberate the sugars, the amino acids from proteins, the nucleotides from nucleic acids, the lipids, etc. And so just as we get our energy from others, the world is full of things that look at us in just the same way, that see us as meat and would like to take our stuff to get them through their day, just as we do with others. We obviously want to stop that. And so it is the immune system that stands between us and these other organisms. Now, the immune system is so incredibly complex that many, professionals spend the rest of their lives studying. So we're going to break it into two parts at first. So we're going to, in this video, cover the innate immune system. And then in the next one, cover the more complex adaptive immune system. So here is a cell, this could say be a white blood cell, performing phagocytosis. Now we could ask the question, were you vaccinated? Where were you born? Where did you go on vacation last year? And for this video, and for all of the videos we'll see today, it doesn't matter. So in other words, we don't care. Why? Because we're studying the innate immune system, that which you were born with, and that which does not change with your experience. So here you see an eosinophil. Eosinophils will be made in your bone marrow, and they will be just as good at fighting worms, regardless of where you were born, regardless of where you were vaccinated, regardless of where you went on vacation. Here you see a mast cell that then releases inflammatory granules and causes inflammation. You can become inflamed around a wound site, whether you were vaccinated or not. Here we see a part of the brain that can start a fever. That can happen regardless of what part of the world you were born in or lived in, etc. And so there are parts of your immunity which we refer to as innate immunity. You were born with them, and they will not change over time. So that's the topic for today. That's not to say that vaccines aren't important, for example. They're important in the concept of adaptive immunity, which will be the topic of the next video. So if you were to start off with a bacterium, which could divide every 10 minutes, well, this is exponential growth. And by the end of the day, you could actually have, if you could, let this go on and give the bacteria enough food and take away their waste, so many bacteria that would weigh as much as planet Earth. Within several days, you would have more bacteria than there are protons in the universe. Exponential growth is a scary thing. Look at all of those bacteria. And so how do we protect ourselves from these bacteria? Well, our first line of defense is the anatomical barriers that we put in the way of these microbes so that they can't get at our stuff. So if we consider the outside of our body, or even the tubes and tracts which leave our body, here we have epithelia. So we have these cells making a wall around our body. And if you remember your epithelia, remember that they have junctions. So there are proteins which go from one cell to another. Many even have fusions of their cell membranes or a proteoglycan glue which joins them. Either way, they form a barrier. Unlike connective tissue, where you have one cell over here and one cell over here, epithelium, each cell is holding on to another, making it difficult for any bacteria, et cetera, to penetrate this. Now, in many parts of the body, we just don't have one cell layer. We have multiple cell layers. So we have epithelia which are stratified. So, say in the lining of your oral cavity, you have stratified epithelia, making an even thicker barrier. And if we look on the outside of our skin, well, we go one step further than that. Not only is the barrier thicker, but it then is keratinized. So these cells die, and then our outermost skin is then this layer of dead interlocked keratinocytes. What better defense against bacteria which would like to infect moist living cells than to surround ourselves in a layer of dead cells? I often joke in class, look at someone else in the room and what you see is dead. I mean, even though you have living cells in you, that's not what we see when we look in the mirror. We see our outer skin, our nails, our hair. These are all the dead cells. But this is in part one of our immune defenses. We're protecting our moist living cells by surrounding ourselves with these dry, dead cells. What's more, any bacteria which attempt to attach here and maybe find their way through, we're constantly sloughing off our skin cells, so these bacteria would be lost. In addition, sweat can take bacteria away from the surface. We have tears going over the surface of our cornea. Urine can remove bacteria from the epithelia of the urethra. And so we have earwax, we have which can catch bacteria. We have, eyebrows and eyelashes, which, try to prevent microbes from entering the eye. We have nasal hairs and nasal mucus, as we'll see. And so one of our first lines of defense are anatomical barriers, actually, walls, which attempt to block microbes from entering our body. And then we even have, ways of clearing these walls. So, sloughing off skin cells or sweat. We can sneeze. We can have diarrhea. We can vomit. And so our first line of defense are these anatomical barriers which we set up. Now, they aren't simply barriers. They're often toxic barriers. Because we then have chemicals associated with these barriers, which actually then make it actually dangerous for microbes. So our skin is salty, okay? Salt creates a hypertonic environment, which then makes it difficult for microbes to grow. They find that, water is leaving their body. Many parts of our body are acidic. So our skin secretes some acids in sweat. The stomach is acidic. And so then, as we will see in our immune system, when we catch microbes in mucus, say in our throat or our trachea, cilia sweep this to our throat and we swallow it into our stomach. The stomach acid then can kill these microbes. We ingest a lot of microbes in food. Once again, stomach acid helps to kill them. The vagina is acidic because the cervix secretes nutrients with the normal flora of the vagina then break into acids. We refer to the term flora very often using referring to microbes. So there are the bacteria which we normally see on the surface of our skin, the normal flora of the skin. There's the normal flora of the oral cavity, etc. Well, the normal bacteria of the vagina break these nutrients into acids, and these acids then help to protect against infection. So an example of this would be if a woman said had a strep throat and then took antibiotics to kill the bacteria causing the strep throat. This antibiotic would also then kill the normal flora of the vagina, which would then mean that there would be less acid, and then a more harmful infection like a yeast infection might follow. So that that vaginal acid was clearly performing a role. Our tears and nasal secretions can have lysozyme. This chemical can break up cell walls of gram-positive bacteria and weakened gram-negative bacteria. And so that's an antimicrobial chemical. And then we have others as well. Cells which are infected by virus can secrete interferons, which encourage neighboring cells to make their antiviral proteins. We have transferrin, which binds iron, making it hard to find, and thus microbes which want transferrin that need iron to thrive have trouble finding it. Our connective tissues are full of a thick hyaluronic acid, which makes it hard to move. So a microbe that wants to spread throughout the body finds that it's difficult to do so. And so in summary, in addition to these anatomical barriers, we have these antimicrobial chemicals, salt, acid, lysozyme, and others, which make it toxic for these foreign microbes to be anywhere near our near our bodies. This then is our first line of defense. So we have anatomical barriers and antimicrobial chemicals, making it difficult for microbes to take our stuff. But that's not enough. Microbes get past this first line of defense. And so therefore we need a second line of defense. And we have a second line of defense in a number of white blood cells. We have neutrophils, we have eosinophils, we have basophils, we have mast cells, macrophages, and monocytes, dendritic cells. These white blood cells can do many different tasks. They can eat microbes, so they can perform phagocytosis. So white blood cells can recognize, hey, you're a bacteria. I have receptors which recognize you as a bacteria. They can send out these pseudopods, these false feet, which then engulf this bacteria in an internal membrane bag known as a vesicle. And then these white blood cells, as we will see, have lots and lots of vesicles with digestive enzymes, which can then kill these bacteria and then break them down. Right. Now, we have different kinds of white blood cells which do this because there are different threats. So here's a neutrophil, as we'll see in a second. Why do we have different kinds of white blood cells? Well, look at the different organisms that want our stuff. There are animals that live on the outside of us, like ticks and lice and mites and fleas, and so we need defenses from them. But then there are also animals which can live inside of us, such as a great variety of worms. Some of the cells which want to take our stuff are big cells with nuclei. So here you see trympanosomes, which can cause a number of diseases like Chagas disease or sleeping sickness in human blood. So those are foreign elements. Here you can see some eukaryotic parasitic cells living inside human cells. So these are the Plasmodium eukaryotic organisms which cause malaria. And then we have bacteria. Notice all the different kinds. There's round bacteria, rod-shaped bacterial, spiral bacteria. There are viruses, there are cancer cells, there are toxins. And so when there are white blood cells, which then our second line of defense, we need different kinds of white blood cells because there are different kinds of infectious agents. So neutrophils, for example, here, bacteria are more of their specialty. So a neutrophil normally just kind of rolls along a capillary wall. But if this is an area which is inflamed, if there are signals that there is a problem in this area, perhaps an infection, the neutrophils will leave the blood and then go into that infected tissue. Neutrophils do many things. One of the reasons that their nucleus, which starts off as being round and then forms these lobes, is that neutrophils and other white blood cells are actually preparing to use their DNA as a weapon. So in case of an infection, neutrophils explode. They kill themselves during an infection to help protect the body. So, pus not only includes bacteria, but also, the remains of bursting neutrophils. And in doing so, they release their DNA. Now, each cell has about 6 feet of DNA. That's an enormous amount. And if this DNA is then released, it forms a trap, this extracellular trap, which then makes it difficult for microbes to move. And so these neutrophils, as they kill themselves, are creating this environment which then is trapping microbes, making their spread less likely. And so that's actually, kind of a new discovery that wasn't known until fairly recently, that DNA actually, used as part of the immune response. Neutrophils are capable of eating bacteria, performing phagocytosis, and they have lots of receptors which let them recognize bacteria. They recognize things which have bound antibodies, as we'll see. So when an antibody, say, sticks to a bacteria, the neutrophil then recognizes it as foreign. So here, not only might this neutrophil eat this bacteria by itself, but once the green antibodies bind to these microbes, the neutrophil recognizes it as, aha, this is something, foreign which needs phagocytosis. Think of it, perhaps as a handle, which is easy to grab. So as we'll see, that's what's known as opsonization, when an antibody binds something and thus making phagocytosis of that more likely. All right, and so neutrophils are often the first white blood cell to reach a wound site. So during an infection, they increase in great numbers. Those are macrophages. We'll get to those. Neutrophils can then leave the capillary because they're responding to signals of inflammation. And once they get to a wound site, they then begin phagocytosis of microbes, of debris, of anything which has bound antibodies. And so as white blood cells, they're in our blood, neutrophils are actually the most common circulating white blood cell. Once again, they leave and they and other white blood cells will leave during inflammation, responding to inflammatory signals. They can then squeeze past these endothelial cells because neutrophils, like other white blood cells, are capable of moving the same way that amoeba do. They kind of reform their cytoskeleton, and thus this allows them to squeeze through the endothelial lining. Once they ingest bacteria, the granules of neutrophils are full of toxic chemicals, which can then kill the bacteria. So these are lots of digestive enzymes. So you can see all of the different digestive enzymes in the granules of neutrophils. This then makes it toxic to be inside a neutrophil. So when neutrophils perform phagocytosis, these toxic enzymes can then rip that microbe into pieces. Okay. So neutrophils thus are part of the innate immune system. They go to inflamed, infected sites. They perform phagocytosis um, of microbes and debris. Now, in the next concept, when we talk, the next video, when we talk about the lymphocytes in adaptive immune responses, I mean, neutrophils have some action there as well. They can signal lymphocytes. So that's, maybe something which, can be considered later as well. Lots of immune cells talk to each other. But neutrophils will be doing these actions regardless of whether you were vaccinated or not, or where you went on vacation. So thus, they are considered to be part of the innate immune system. And then there are other white blood cells like eosinophils. They have granules. The granules of eosinophils also then have a variety of toxic byproducts. One of the things that eosinophils specialize in is worms. So while worms aren't a huge threat in the United States, about, on average, about half of the people alive today have some sort of parasitic worm. They are a source of common infections. They are tragically a great source of mortality. So nematodes, tapeworms, flukes, these are very common and can occur in the United States as well. That's one of the things that these eosinophil granules specialize in. And so when there is a large animal like a parasitic worm, these eosinophils can then just be in the vicinity of the worm, spitting out their toxic materials, which then is a defense against the worm, making it very difficult for those worms to thrive. Eosinophils are also capable of forming those extracellular traps, just as neutrophils did. But in eosinophils, one other thing that their traps have is that their granules can actually migrate along the DNA and adhere there. And so if a worm is in a peripheral tissue, it can actually then bump up against this DNA, which is helping to contain it. But these granules full of toxic elements can actually then more or less serve as a landmine, which would then release all of those toxins in the vicinity of the worm. Now, eosinophils come up a lot. Some of those aspects of that last video were relative to asthma. So when eosinophils are in the lungs, the release of their granules promote remodeling of the tissue. And unfortunately, the remodeling of the tissue can actually make predisposition to asthma worse. So, there's more to eosinophils than fighting against worms, but that is one of their specialties. Mast cells and basophils have very large granules which are full of inflammatory signals. Inflammatory signals are important because there are white blood cells here which can help in an infection, but they will stay in the blood unless they are signaled to leave the blood and go into a peripheral tissue. So something like a mast cell or a basophil releasing signals of inflammation will then encourage other white blood cells to leave the blood to the peripheral tissues where they can help fight against infections and the like. So, just as we look at like fire alarms and other aspects, they're very important because without an alarm, we don't bring the people to the site of an emergency who are capable of dealing with it. In the same way, when we look at the components of the granules of basophils or mast cells, these are critical because these are signaling other elements of the immune system that they need to come and help mount a defense against microbes, worms, and the like. So basophils have a number of signaling molecules in their granules, as do mast cells, as you can see here. Basophils are capable of releasing their DNA and forming those traps, just as we had seen in those other in those other videos, as can mast cells. And let's say there's the infection of a worm. The eosinophils are the ones who are releasing toxic granules against the worm. But the basophils and mast cells, their inflammatory signals are helping to bring the eosinophils there. And so how do we know to react against an animal living inside of us? Well, the mast cells help to bring elements there. And in allergy, we'll be talking about mast cells and basophils again. But allergy is an adaptive response for things like those parasites like worms, because what enables an allergy is that antibodies stick to mast cells. And so when an antigen is present, all right, so when there's this foreign element present, then this triggers inflammation. It triggers, say, this mast cell to release all of these inflammatory granules. Well, certainly this is something we don't like when we are reacting to something which isn't toxic, like grass pollen or peanut butter or bee stings, etc. But in case of worm infections and other ectoparasites, it's something in this parasitic organism which is triggering then IgE, which triggers the release of inflammatory granules from these mast cells. This inflammation in the area where there is an infectious organism then brings many different types of white blood cells, which can then help protect us against those things. So here, if an antigen binds and the IgE antibody on the surface of a mast cell, and then the mast cell releases its inflammatory granules. So inflammation is part of our innate immune responses, and basophils and mast cells are very good at inflammation. Monocytes are cells of the innate immune system, which are in the blood. And then when they leave the blood, they become larger, and then they become cells which we call either macrophages or these more spindly dendritic cells. So macrophages and dendritic cells are important in the innate immune system. Because they are so much larger, they can not only eat bacteria, but they can also eat yeast cells. They can eat fungi. They can perform phagocytosis of larger things in an attempt to protect the body. They can even then perform phagocytosis of large, old worn out red blood cells, or even neutrophils, which have eaten bacteria. So I know that sounds odd, but if neutrophils perform phagocytosis of lots of red bacteria, the macrophage can then perform phagocytosis of the neutrophil with the bacteria inside. Macrophages can also eat things that antibodies have stuck to. So if antibodies signal that something is foreign and a threat, macrophages can then ingest that. So they are very good at phagocytosis, these macrophages and dendritic cells. And then even they do something which is very important in the adaptive immune system in the next video. They eat foreign objects, they rip them apart, and then they wear them and thus present to lymphocytes and say, hey, you need to react against this. This is something that I've just encountered. So they help to educate lymphocytes on the threats which need to be reacted against. So here you can see a macrophage. It rips up a foreign element, but then it wears part of it as bound to a receptor. And when a lymphocyte then interacts with this, this then triggers the lymphocyte into action, as we will see in the next video. So monocytes, they become macrophages and dendritic cells when they leave circulation, and these function in the innate immune system. Now, I'm winding down on the innate immune system, but I would just like to say that certainly the adaptive immune system and the antibodies and the lymphocytes, they certainly get a lot of attention. But we shouldn't neglect the innate immune system. The innate immune system is actually more complex than many individuals give it credit for. Now, I use the term macrophages and dendritic cells, and then I referred to monocytes. And while, I'm happy to move on, the reality is that there are different classes of these. So there are different kinds of monocyte. Maybe not, that essential that you know this in, a beginning class, but if you were going to then enter the health professions, because these are so important, knowing the difference between different kinds of monocyte might be important. There are different kinds of macrophages. While some mature from monocytes, which have left circulation, actually some macrophages formed during fetal development without being monocytes first. And these macrophages can actually divide on their own. And so how do we get new macrophages? Some differentiate from monocytes from the blood, but others are leftovers from fetal development, and some of those can actually then perform their own cell division. So once again, there are different kinds of macrophages, which can then have slightly different types of functions. So, maybe we treat them all, as just macrophages in an introductory lecture. But if we wanted to go further, distinguishing between different classes might be important. In the same way, there are different types of dendritic cells. Some come from monocytes, which form in the blood and then leave and then specialize. But then some actually differentiate from precursors in the bone marrow that aren't monocytes, that then form these pre-dendritic cells, which then go to tissues. Right, so they can end up as being Langerhans cells in the skin, or the dendritic cells of alveoli. And once again, they're dendritic cells, but they're distinct from each other. And maybe at some point, those distinctions are important to you. Dendritic cells then can encounter microbes in the periphery, but then some can actually then go to lymphatic vessels and then move to a lymph node or the thymus. So they're not done until they differentiate there. And now that they're in the lymph node or the thymus, their goal is education. They're educating lymphocytes on what the immune response needs to be. So just a quick point, we often skip over the innate immune system and focus on the more complex adaptive immune system. But we shouldn't, then neglect that the innate immune system does have a variety of cells which are more complex than we often give them credit for being. So one last type of cell, there's what's known as an NK cell, or a natural killer cell. These look like lymphocytes. They have many of the attributes of lymphocytes, so they can recognize cancer cells. They can recognize virally infected cells, but they aren't lymphocytes, and they don't do it in the same way that lymphocytes do. So they are kind of actually halfway between innate immunity and adaptive immunity. And so once again, if this is an introductory lecture, then just the fact that NK cells exist, that's fine. But if this is, you're going into the health professions and you want to study in greater detail, the fact that there are these intermediate cells partway between innate and acquired immunity, which look like lymphocytes, but which then have some important differences. So the cytotoxic T lymphocytes and NK cells have a lot in common, but nevertheless, they are then also distinct as well. So just to sum up then, you have stuff. You have sugars, you have proteins, etc. And although you want to take stuff from others today when you eat your meals, you don't want others to take your stuff. You need to protect your stuff from those others. That's where your immunity comes in. And our immunity can be split into an innate half and an adaptive half. Your innate immunity is what you were born with, and it hasn't changed all that much. All right, so you still have stomach acid, you still have all of these, white blood cells which function whether you were vaccinated or not, whether you went on vacation to another country or not. And so our innate immunity consists of anatomical barriers, physical walls, which separate us from those other things, antimicrobial chemicals, which make those walls toxic. That's your first line of defense. But that's not enough. So microbes make it through the first line of defense, in which case we have then a second line of defense. We have all these white blood cells. They can perform phagocytosis. They can release inflammatory signals and promote inflammation, which draws white blood cells to a problem site. They can even send signals to the hypothalamus of the brain, where the hypothalamus then raises body temperature and causes a fever. Now, some fevers are actually caused by microbes. They're dangerous and they need to be controlled. They need to be brought down. But most fevers are actually caused by the body itself as part of our defenses. You see, if we were to touch a surface, all right, maybe there's a bacteria there that could cause an infection. But that's actually impressive, because here's a bacteria on a colder surface, which then can cause an infection in this 100-degree body. And that's a big temperature range for microbes to be successful in. Very often, the microbes which cause infections, the 100 degrees of the body, that's the upper limit of the temperatures that they can stand. And so therefore, the hypothalamus decides, hey, if I could raise temperature just a little bit, cause a fever, then microbes might not be able to thrive in that environment. They might die, or at the very least, they might slow down and buy the body time, the immune system time to catch up. Now, we don't like fevers. Like, we feel hot, and then we feel miserable. We don't feel like, doing exercise or outside activities. We just want to lay in bed. But that's actually what we should be doing. If there's an infection in our bodies, we should take our body's resources and apply it to the immune system so that we can fight this infection. If we're running around outside, then there's less energy going to immune tissues. And so even though we don't like having a fever, it's actually a sign that most of the time that our body's immune responses are working. Now, we're tempted to take something to make the fever go away. Now, that's fine. All right, so we'll feel better, and maybe we'll say, oh, I'll go outside after all. But the problem then is we might actually be sick longer. So if your temperature goes down and now you don't feel as miserable, you don't feel like staying inside, then that's great that you feel better. But now you're not fighting the microbe as efficiently as you otherwise would have. And now actually you might be sick longer because your immune system didn't control for it the way you would have. Finally, because the immune system is so involved, I have kind of this series where it kind of simulates a war between your immune system and microbes. And so, all of the white blood cells are, talking as if they were, generals, and soldiers fighting in a war. And that's just, a way that maybe this makes it a little more clear. So here, as part of your innate immune system, we have a monocyte which left the blood and became a macrophage. Here we have those keratinocytes, which are dying so that there's this dead layer of epithelial cells surrounding our body that microbes have difficulty going through. There's a phase where they talk about making mucus, which traps microbes, say in the trachea or in the nasal cavities, and then the cilia, which sweep this mucus away from the delicate lungs, and they sweep it then into the stomach, where we have all of that acid. And so this mucus, which has trapped gunk, can then be swept into the stomach and the microbes killed here, acid being one of those antimicrobial chemicals. Then there's one which runs through the body, and you realize that there are so many parts of the body which have some degree of function in the lymphatic system. We have reticular tissue where, microbes can be, trapped, but there's tonsils, there's Peyer patches. And so, this kind of runs through all of these diverse structures throughout the body. Which are parts of the immune system. There are a number of parts of the body that make antimicrobial chemicals, whether it be sweat in the skin or acid in the stomach or the vagina, or the transferrin, which binds iron, etc. And so, one video goes through a whole set of these, and then others, progress and follow the infection as, neutrophils are going there and trying to perform phagocytosis, as macrophages secrete a pyrogen, which goes to the hypothalamus and causes it to start a fever, etc. So the immune system is really complicated. And so I have a number of videos which go through all of these points in much greater detail. This video here was just meant to be an overview of all of these. So please, if there were any questions that you had, or any of these points where you wanted more of an explanation, feel free to visit these individual videos for more explanation there.